So last week we began a new section of Isaiah, chapters 7 through 12. And one of the major ideas of this section is the idea of Emmanuel, God with us. And we saw specifically a reference to a baby named Emmanuel who is going to be born, and the whole idea that God is with us. I'd like to, we're coming to chapter 9 today, but to begin I want to take a look just at a few things at the end of chapter 8. So at the end of chapter 8, in verse 13, Isaiah says, "The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. And he will be a sanctuary. But for both houses of Israel he will be a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. And for the people of Jerusalem he will be a trap and a snare. Many of them will stumble. They will fall and be broken. They will be snared and captured." So here, as we mentioned last week, Isaiah is basically offering the people a choice. God is holy. He is always holy, and his character never changes. But you might experience God as a sanctuary, or you might experience God as a stumbling stone, depending on how you react to him and how you obey him. Right? And so the remainder of chapter 8, we see a contrast between those who follow God and trust him, like Isaiah and his disciples, and those who do not, like the rest of the country. In verse 16, Isaiah says, "Bind up the testimony and seal up the law among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will put my trust in him. Here am I, and the children the Lord has given me. We are signs and symbols in Israel for the Lord Almighty, who dwells in Mount Zion." So you remember that God had given Isaiah 2 sons, and each of them had symbolic names. One was named "A Remnant Shall Return," and the other was named "Quick to the plunder, hurry to the spoil." Right? Strange names, but every time those names were spoken, it was a message to the people around who heard. Right? So Isaiah says "I will wait for the Lord." But now contrast that with what is going on in the lives of the people around him. They are experiencing the Assyrians coming in and threatening or oppressing the people, eventually totally taking over and obliterating the northern kingdom of Israel, and providing serious threat to Judah, taking over all of the country except for Jerusalem. And this is what they're experiencing, and in that time they were tempted to turn to the occult and to seek out spiritists and mediums and to find out some truths from beyond the current reality, from what they can see. And we see that in verse 19. "When men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony." In other words, that's where you should be placing your faith, in what God has said. "If they do not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn." Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. And then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Man, that is a lot of darkness in those few verses, right? Just bumbling around, trying to find their way, distressed and hungry, and then they will look they will curse their God. What a contrast that is with just a few verses earlier where Isaiah says, I will wait for the Lord. I will wait for the Lord. They will curse their God. And so that's the contrast we have between those who follow God and his ways and trust him, and those who do not. Now, this reference to darkness is the way that Isaiah provides a nice transition into the very next chapter. Right? Let's look at chapter 9, verse 1. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea along the Jordan. Okay, so here he is beginning to present some hope for the people, and he talks about the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. So that was the part of Israel way far to the north. So Isaiah was prophesying to Judah, but his interest was not only in Judah and Jerusalem. His interest really encompassed the entire Jewish nation, both of them, although his primary focus was on Judah. But here he's saying that this far northern part, the part that was the first to be oppressed by the Assyrians because they came in from the north, they got there first. But these people are going to be the first to see the light. And guess what? Where was it that Christ had his first ministry? In Capernaum, just north of Galilee. This area, right here. That's where Jesus came first. It was his hometown.
Actually, I read one time where he was born in Zebulun. That's where Nazareth was.
But he was not born in Bethlehem, though, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, he grew up in
yes,
right.
yes,
Nazareth, which
right.
is Zebulun.
In Zebulun,
and
yes.
then his ministry was mainly in Capernaum, but around that area.
Right, exactly. So this is a prophecy that Isaiah is giving without really even fully understanding what he's saying, right? And that's what so much of it is. Did you have a comment?
What was that? It was the two, sorry, last week, the two types of prophecy.
An event prophecy and a typological prophecy.
Thank you.
Right. So, and we also have a reference here to the Galilee of the Gentiles. So that's an interesting terminology. Basically, this is the area where the Jewish people interacted more with people from outside of Israel than any place else, because there was a major road there called the Way of the Sea, where they would come from Damascus along the north part of the Sea of Galilee and over to the coast, the Mediterranean coast. And then when they could go along the coast, it would be it's a low-lying area, and it's a way that it would be easy travel down to Egypt. So that would be the main way that people would go. It's called the Way of the Sea, and that's where people would interact so much with the rest of the world. That's why it was called Galilee of the Gentiles, or Galilee of the nations. So then we read on in beginning in verse 2, a terrific poem, right? And I'd like to have somebody else read that for me, 2 through 7. Mary Jo, do you want to read that?
You know, my eyes are not
Okay.
doing well this morning.
Do you
and
want
I've got-
somebody else?
Yes, please. I'm just not. this is
Rick, would
small
you
print.
read this for us?
The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this.
All right. It's a tremendous passage, yes?
I almost sang it.
Well, that would have been fine. We do know this passage so well because we're set to music that it's so very memorable, right?
What's this in
We read-
Matthew 4, 15 through 16? It's repeated, I guess, there too. I've got a footnote here.
I am not certain that reference, Matthew 4. If you want to look it up
It
and
may
share
just
with
be
us.
a cross-reference for the theme.
Yeah.
I think it's a cross reference if you want to look it up
Well,
and see
and
what.
Matthew quotes that section.
Does he?
To us a child.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
so. I think so. I think that's,
All right, well, since we're talking about it, we will
Just
look
put it
this up. Matthew 4.
Isaiah said it first.
Yeah.
well, Matthew was quoting Isaiah when he said it.
Exactly, yeah,
Matthew 4, what did you say, 15?
15 and 16.
Right.
Yep.
Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea along the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, and so on. So this is, right, it's a reference to Jesus being,
Yeah.
beginning to preach in Capernaum and coming from Nazareth. So it's specifically regarding the geography. Right. So this passage provides a nice climax to the section that we've been dealing with. Remember, we started off with a king who was very unfaithful, King Ahaz, and he did not trust in God. And we end with this description of the ideal monarch, which provides a tremendous contrast with King Ahaz. And that's it's also the culmination of Isaiah's use of his children to show God's control over history. We've talked about children a lot in this passage, and in this child ends all wars and establishes a kingdom of peace and justice. Okay. So the structure of this hymn or this poem is like this. Verses 2 and 3, we have the people have joy. And verses 4 and 5, they have joy because they have peace. Verses 4 and 5. And in verse 6, they have peace because the ideal king has been born. And in verse 7, that king whose kingdom is characterized by justice and righteousness, and it will never end. Okay?
It's a passage we read every Christmas Eve.
We do.
Yeah.
We do. About the light coming.
Yep.
Right. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Look at the verb tense that Isaiah is using. They have seen a great light, and a light has dawned. Had this happened yet when Isaiah was living?
No.
It had not, but yet he speaks of it in the past tense. Because this is an example of what we sometimes call the prophetic perfect tense, meaning Isaiah was so sure of the reality of this event that he could speak of the future as if it was already past.
Which is that very first sentence in verse 1. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, right. That there will be no more gloom. That's definitely a future tense. But here we have they have seen the light, and the light has dawned.
Yep.
And so no medium or spiritist could possibly have such assurance of the future, could they? But Isaiah could,
Yeah.
because he was inspired by God. Verse 3 says that you have enlarged the nation. So here we have the joy of abundance. So instead of being plunder, the people are actually dividing the plunder, right? They have, they're dividing the spoils of the victory of their king. In verse 4, we have, for as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke. So the day of Midian's defeat, that's a reference to the deliverance under Gideon, right? Remember how Gideon and his army, they shattered the jug, and so the light would shine out.
Mhm.
Well, here, as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke. So the light, you know, he's using this tremendous historical reference to talk about the light just shining out, coming from their Messiah. And then I love verse 5. I think we kind of read over it so quickly when generally, but it says, every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning and will be fuel for the fire. So this is a reference to peace, right? So, you know, the warriors didn't need their boots anymore because they weren't fighting. And all those garments that were rolled in blood, they were free to roll them up and throw them in the fire because they didn't need those anymore either. This is a example of a type of a literary device where you take the lesser thing to include the greater. So in other words, if the clothes are burned up and the boots are burned up, well, they didn't need the weapons and the armaments anymore either, right? So it's the lesser things, and symbolizes the whole thing. And I was thinking about this week, thinking what an interesting movie sequence this would make. You know, you start at the beginning, you have darkness and just shadows and people moving around and just trying to find food, trying to go visit the Akal, just kind of walking, moving around in the shadows in the forest and so on, and trying to stay away from the enemy. And in the background, all you hear is just the trampling of feet of the warriors just marching in. And that's what your first scene is, just this terrible darkness, right? And then in the second scene, what you see is a fire. And suddenly the soundtrack goes entirely quiet. And all that is happening is just the fire that is throwing up embers. And somebody throws on some boots, and it flames up. And somebody throws on a rolled up old jacket filled with blood, and it flames up. And the people are sitting around, and it's all quiet. And it's all peace.
Oh, good.
Yeah?
Yep.
And that's the picture that we have here.
And then the dawn comes, yeah.
Yes, then the dawn comes. And that's the picture that we have here of the peace coming from the Messiah.
Yeah.
And so he says in verse 6, to us a child is born. So this future ruler is going to have a very human arrival.
Yeah.
You know, he's going to be born. And his title, however, emphasizes his divine character. He says it's not just an ordinary baby, is it? Right? This child is the ultimate fulfillment of God with us. So let's look at these titles that he is given here. Each one is an adjective plus a noun, right? We have a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, an everlasting Father, and usually translated Prince of Peace. We could say peaceful prince, right?
Oh.
So the wonderful counselor, counselor refers to somebody who determines and carries out a plan of action. And in this case, his royal program will cause the world to marvel because it's so absolutely amazing. He's also the mighty God. This emphasizes his divine power as a warrior. Okay? He's the everlasting Father. He will be compassionate, provider, and protector of his people. And also, he is the Prince of Peace. His rule will bring well-being to both to the individual and to society. Right, and there will be no end. So this future ruler will not just simply be another in the long line of Davidic kings, just the next son of the previous father and so on. He will be the last one, and he will be forever. The last king, and he will be the eternal king. And it is clear from when you read this that Isaiah has a future divine king in mind. And he will show God with us not merely by eliminating the threat of Syria and of Israel and of Assyria. He will be God with us by establishing an endless rule of justice, righteousness, and peace.
That's great.
And the zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So Isaiah knew that God loved his people passionately, but he could not sit by disinterestedly and watch them drift away into bondage. And he would not rest until he had restored them to himself, giving them the kind of government that would allow them to find themselves in him. Okay. So let's look a little bit deeper at these titles that he has given. And my question is, how do we see Jesus in his lifetime exhibiting the truths shown by these titles, right? So how, for example, did Jesus show himself as a wonderful counselor during his time on earth? Can you think of some examples?
Well, I know in the Mary and Martha story, when he told Martha, Mary has sought the most important thing.
Yes,
That's kind of a sense of counseling.
it is indeed. Right, very good.
The lady at the well, I guess.
Right,
You know.
good. I
The great,
had that on my paper too.
Sin no more. You know.
Right.
even the Great Commandment and the Great Commission,
Yeah.
that's the, the plan of action
Right, he was
for the mission
teaching.
of the church.
He was teaching. Mm-hmm. Right, he was a great teacher.
Right. How about when he addressed his mother even at the cross and then told John to
Yeah.
take care of his mother, basically,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Okay. Yes.
Plans of compassion.
He did come with a plan. I was thinking also of the time when the lawyer came to him and said, "Who is my neighbor?" And then he told a story. We know the story as the story of the Good Samaritan, illustrating who the neighbor really is, somebody who cares for someone, who is kind, whether or not they live next to each other. Yeah. So how do we see God, Jesus acting as a mighty God during his time on earth?
Miracles.
That would be the biggest one, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. All sorts of miracles he did. How about acting as an everlasting Father?
Well, I think of the father image is when he says, "Don't keep the children from me,"
Yeah, good.
Forbid them not.
Fits right into that compassionate provider and protector. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Anything else?
How about when he was praying for us, for his disciples
Mm-hmm.
in the garden?
Right.
It also shows the unity of the Trinity too. I mean, the
Yeah.
Father,
Mm-hmm.
he's the Son, but the unity of the Trinity.
Okay, right. When Jesus was praying for us, he said, "You've given me my disciples, and I haven't lost anyone,
Right.
except for the son of perdition," he termed Judas Iscariot. And he prayed that they would be protected, that his disciples would be protected from the evil one in the world as he left them. And that was very definitely a fatherly, compassionate image. Anything else?
Mhm.
I'm thinking of the feeding of the 5,000,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
When he provided physical food, which they
Yeah.
actually really did need.
It was more than a miracle, it was a provision.
Right,
Mhm.
right. And this was not just to demonstrate something, it was a true legitimate need.
Yeah.
Okay? Where do we see Jesus as the Prince of Peace in his lifetime?
When he calmed the storm.
Okay?
Turn the other cheek.
Yes?
When he forgave
Yeah.
everyone from the cross, forgave
Yeah.
them
Yes.
for they
Yes.
know not what they do.
In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he told his disciples not to fight,
Right.
but Peter did anyway, and he restored the
Ear.
guy's ear,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Forgive those who do not know what they're doing.
They don't know what they're doing. That's right.
Forgiveness.
That's right. Okay. So we definitely see Jesus acting in this way. Do we see him acting like this in our lives today? Do you have examples of him acting like a wonderful counselor in your life?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Anybody care to share?
Well, I think he provides certainly counsel through his word,
Mm-hmm.
but he also provides us counsel through other believers. That they may not even know that they're being used by the Lord to provide what we need at that time. So yes, I feel like I've experienced that counselor role for sure.
I just think back to when I accepted Jesus and the plan that he had for me. And Jeremiah 29:11 is always one that pops into my mind, that foretold God's plans for
Oh, yeah, yeah.
future and a hope, you know.
How about God as a mighty God? You see him acting as a mighty God in your life? With power? As a warrior? Perhaps? I think part of the experience of God as a mighty God is his work in your own life or in my own life to clean out that sin and those terrible bad habits that I have in my own life. That takes a lot of power, more power than I have, to make myself into a better person, to become holy. That's only the work of God in me. Right? How about everlasting Father? Do you see him acting like an everlasting Father in your life?
Absolutely.
How so?
I remember this one specifically, and you probably all heard this story, is when after Roger died and, I needed a different car because my car was so bad. And, my mechanic said, don't buy a car without bringing it to me, type of thing.
Mhm.
And then this man called and offered me a free car. And he did it because he said the Bible said you're supposed to take care of the widows.
Oh.
And so I called my mechanic and he said over the phone, well, I'll tell you right now, Mary Jo, most cars people want to give away aren't worth anything.
Well, that's true enough, I'm sure. And how was it?
It was, and then he called me back and said, Mary Jo, this is a good car. And, at that point, I really felt very strongly, God is taking care of me.
Mhm.
Because I'd never bought a car on my own. I mean, I
Right.
never owned a car till I married Roger, and he always bought the cars. I mean,
Yeah.
I approved, but he bought them.
Right.
So anyway, so it's really,
Being taken care of.
yeah, a real sense that, God was there to take care of me. He was going
Yeah.
to take care of me.
That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I see the Constitution kind of, our leaders back, the Constitution was written, it seems like they're pulling it out of the Bible.
The Bible was a major influence in
Yeah.
in that thinking, yes.
We the people, you know?
More dependence on a God.
Yeah, I think the concept of God was a bit more generalized than our
Right.
concept of a Christian
Yeah,
personal deity. But what about God as I was going to give an example of everlasting Father. You know, I think some people have particularly a time of worship when they present their offerings to God in church, in the offering, right? For me, the time when I feel God acting in a fatherly way in provision is when I am at home and I'm allocating funds into various different budget categories. This may sound really weird, but
No.
there
Well,
was
yeah, you're right. That's
there
right.
was there was a so long. Okay.
Yeah.
There was so much of our life that we didn't have enough money. And so, here we had these budget categories and there was no money to put in them,
I
And,
just shuffle zero around.
Yeah, you move zero from this column to that column, it's still zero. And now, God has brought us into a different chapter, and I'm incredibly thankful,
Yeah,
right?
I would say that too in my life, you know. And,
But even that, sitting down with the budget also, to me, shows the picture of God gives us what we need, not necessarily what we want in our worldly desires, but the basic needs,
Yeah, yeah, he does. He does
Yeah.
indeed.
which can lead to contentment.
That's right.
So, how does God show himself as a Prince of Peace in your life?
Just,
Go on.
just turning to him and praying to him gives me peace.
Mhm.
You know, just takes the anxiety away.
Right.
And some of the times, I would say, especially right now in the world situation, you look at the news and you think, oh my land, it's going to hell in a handbag.
You can use the word.
I remember one night ABC News, I got done half an hour watching the news, and I thought, oh, this is horrible. There was nothing good in the news, practically. And those are the times when I think you really need to just give it to God and say, but I know you're in charge,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that you have a good outcome here, even if it looks like it's falling apart all around us. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's like, I think of the news on those special, what was that Charles Kuralt thing that's still being done now?
Oh, yeah, On the Road.
On the Road or whatever.
Oh,
Just is always kind of a happy story, whereas
Yeah.
the main part of the news is always focusing on the
Horrible stuff.
horrible stuff.
Yeah.
And that's
Fire
where
they go.
God's presence always brings you to on that road type feeling, of, hey, I'm with you. I'm on the road with you.
Mm-hmm.
So it was interesting, that same night I turned to NBC, and they do that. They
Yeah.
put some good stories in there. But
At the
that
end,
night
yeah.
with ABC, it was all a disaster.
Yeah.
There were fires here, and there was pulling out of Syria there, and it was just a disaster. Every place you looked, it was a disaster. The federal government was falling apart. It was just a disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. It does
I
look
think-
like that.
When I think of Prince of Peace, in the world, peace is really temporary, right? Because we're all human and something's gonna flare up again somewhere, right? But, to me, this means overall, he reigns as the ruler in my heart of peace, that's available to everybody, but I know by living in this world, somebody's gonna get mad at somebody over here, somebody's gonna get mad at somebody over there, bullets are gonna fly. But, what does that mean for me? How do I make him rule as that ruler of peace in my heart, And, there's a lot of turmoil inside of here, how do you
Mhm.
let him settle that internal?
And in our case, the experience of peace that we have, we're experiencing peace not in the midst of peace. We're experiencing peace in the midst of chaos.
Right.
Yeah. And it's
And
Do
I
you-
think that's been the story of the people of God all, it's
Mhm.
always been going to hell in a handbasket.
True.
We may not have seen it on ABC News, but they saw it right in front
Or
of
on
them.
our phones.
Yeah. They saw it right in front of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, and there are many Bible interpreters who would say that this passage is not completely fulfilled in the time of Jesus in his life here on earth, or in the time of the church now, but there will come a time in the future when it will be a specific kingdom, right? A time when he will rule in literal reality.
A millennial
A
kingdom?
millennial kingdom, right? And the word millennial comes from, of course, Revelation, which is why I didn't use that term, because we're not there yet. But here, but that there would be a literal kingdom. And I was thinking about this, trying to run through my mind, wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. How would we see those different aspects in a millennial kingdom, right? And to be perfectly honest, I had difficulty, because I think that our understanding of a future kingdom is extremely limited, because we haven't experienced it yet.
Yeah.
We have some scriptures, but to really stop and think about it and contemplate it and meditate on it, it's very hard, because we don't have all the data to use. And that's part of what it means to have hope for a future, because hope is based on reality. It's based on specific scriptures that God has given to us, but it's not based on complete knowledge. If it's complete knowledge, it's not hope anymore. It's something else. It's fact, But God has given us a hope for the future. I believe there will be a time when there will be a literal kingdom on earth. And we're going to come to the number of passages that talk about that throughout the book of Isaiah, and we try to put some of that together. Now, beginning in chapter 9, verse 8, through chapter 10, verse 4, we have a section here where we're talking about God's judgment against Israel. And it's interesting that Isaiah includes this, because primarily he was talking to Judah and the people around Jerusalem, but here he has this section addressed to Israel. It's as if he is using the experience of Israel as a warning example for the people of Judah. Right? And so we have 4 stanzas in this passage, and at the end of each one we have this expression. Look at end of chapter 12, verse 12, I'm sorry. Chapter 9, verse 12, the last part says, "Yet for all this, his anger is not turned away, his hand is still upraised." Okay, look at the end of verse 17. "Yet for all this, his anger is not turned away, his hand is still upraised." End of verse 21, same words. The end of chapter 10, verse 4, the same words. So I have this refrain going on. But God, for all these terrible things that are happening to Israel, God is still angry, and his hand in anger is still raised up, and he hasn't turned away. It's really a fearful image here. His hand is raised up. You might imagine a club in his hand, and it's still there. All of this bad stuff is happening, and it's not the end. And Isaiah sees pride as primarily the root of all other sin. And we see that over and over in his writing. And he expresses that so amazingly well in chapter 9, verse 10, this quotation from Ephraim, or Israel. They say, "The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with dressed stone. The fig trees have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars." So, the first incursion of Assyria was in 732 BC, but into Israel. But Israel didn't fall until 722, so there were 10 years there where they were being oppressed by the Assyrians, and they said, the bricks have all fallen down, and God wanted this oppression to bring them humility, right? And he wanted them to see, my goodness, we need to turn to God. And what was their reaction? The reaction was extreme arrogance. The bricks have fallen down, and we're going to replace them with dressed stone. All those measly little fig trees they've been taken down, we're going to plant cedars.
So it's a tear down and build up. Yeah.
Well, they were, in their arrogance, they were going to rebuild their nation that was being destroyed by God. Right?
You know,
They'll do it better.
And they will do it, it'll be even better. They'll improve on things.
We can do this.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
It almost reminds you of after 9/11, everything came tumbling down, but we made it bigger. We rebuilt it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, in beginning chapter 10, verse 5, we have God saying, bringing judgment against Assyria. So Assyria has been the one that God has used to destroy the kingdom of Israel. But now the destroyer will be destroyed. And again, the primary issue for Assyria is their arrogance and their pride. Where are we at? Right. In verse chapter 10, verse 7. But this is not what he intends. Okay, I'm going to go back. 10, verse 5. Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. I send him against a godless nation. The godless nation was Israel. Godless? Absolutely. I dispatch him against a people who anger me, to seize, loot, and snatch plunder. Does that sound anything like Isaiah's children? Remember the name? Quick to the plunder, hurry to the spoil. There's his name right there. I've sent him to seize loot and to snatch plunder and to trample them down like mud in the streets. But this is not what he, that's the king of Assyria, intends. This is not what he has in mind. His purpose is to destroy, to put an end to many nations. And here's what the king of Assyria says. Are not all my commanders kings? And has not this place fared just like that one, and the next place fared just like that other one? He has a whole list of all these geographical places getting closer and closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. And verse 10, has my hand seized the kingdoms of the idols, kingdoms whose images excel those of Jerusalem and Samaria? Shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images as I dealt with Samaria and her idols? As far as Assyria is concerned, they are totally unaware that God is using them to be God's instrument. In their mind, they have this plan, and they're just checking off the nations off their list. First we have Syria, then we have Israel, then we have Judah. In verse 12, when the Lord has finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done this, and by my wisdom, because of my understanding, I removed the boundaries of nations, I plundered their treasures, like a mighty one, I subdued their kings. And God is saying, you may think it's all you, dude, but it's not. And in the end, God is going to bring judgment on Assyria as well. Okay. Then we have this short section about a remnant of Israel being saved. In verse 21, it says, a remnant will return. There again is Isaiah's other child. Okay? a remnant will return. That was his first son's name. And here he comes back in verse 21, this reference. So these two chapters that we've looked at today, quite a contrast, really. We see that God is with us. First, we have this message of hope that we have with the coming of the Messiah. So God is with us in that sense. But the last part that we just went over rather quickly is a message of judgment. And God is with us as a judge as well. And it all depends on how we respond to him, which way he is with us, right? That implies that we ought to be looking to him that we should treat him as our Lord, right? That he is our Lord. As lordship of God is not an option for the Christian. It is the essence of being a follower of him. I think sometimes people look at being a Christian as what can God do for me? And God can give me salvation, and God can give me peace, and God can give me all these good things. But the essence of being a Christian is that I follow him, that I treat him as my Lord, and that I obey him and I worship him. And that's not an option. And God doesn't treat it as an option either. Let's close in prayer today. Dear Father, we do acknowledge you as our Lord. It's not just something that we say, it's something that we intend. And it's a life that we intend to live. We pray that you would be in our life the wonderful counselor that we need. That you would show the power of yourself as an almighty God. That you would provide for our needs as we know that you do as our everlasting Father. And that you would minister peace to our souls as the Prince of Peace. And we know that you have done this, and sometimes to put it into words, to see all that you've done, we can't see all that you've done, because so much that you have done is behind the scenes that we don't even know. But we acknowledge it nonetheless. And we commit ourselves to you this morning in the name of your Son.